Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So I want to talk about a very special person who we're all going to have a chance to meet this coming Tuesday evening. Her name is Judy Heumann. And Judy Heumann is a leader in disabilities rights. She just came out with a book called Being Human, which I very highly recommend that we all get and read. And she's also the star of a just released Netflix documentary called Crip Camp. Truly a remarkable documentary. And I hope that you all take a look at that documentary before Tuesday evening when she speaks. If you're not familiar with Judy Heumann, she is a rock star. She is to the disabilities rights movement what MLK was to the civil rights movement for African Americans, and I'm hardly overstating it. If you ever wondered why there are dips on every street corner in the sidewalk, that's Judy Heumann. If you ever know a kid who had to get a 504 plan for their special needs in education in public schools, Judy Heumann. If you've ever seen ramps in public buildings or accessible bathrooms or other accessible features in public buildings, that also is Judy Heumann and the remarkable group of leaders who she initially met at a summer camp in the Catskills in the 1960s called Camp Jeanette, which is what the documentary is about. And these kids who were finally not considered weird because they had handicaps, were able to dream together about a better world. And leaders like Judy and others arose up from that. And she changed the world. Judy was stricken with polio when she was a child, when she was growing up in Brooklyn. And also she was a former congregant of mine at Addis Israel. And not only did she teach and change the world, but she also taught me and changed my life. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how she did that. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, the board at Addis Israel unanimously voted in a task force, a disabilities task force that would continually monitor the life of the synagogue to make sure that we were up to date in all of the accessible dimensions of life in a synagogue. And of course, Judy Heumann was the head of that task force. And at the board meeting, when it was voted in, I got up and did my rabbinic thing. And I decided to give a Devar Torah about how the Torah exhorts us over and over again to remember the ger, yatom, v'almana, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. And why do we remember these three typologies? Because they represent those who are the most vulnerable, the people who are the weakest of society, whom we can't ever forget, that a society has to be a society that takes care of those people. And I gave this beautiful Devar Torah, and I sat down feeling very proud of myself that I had just given a great Devar Torah to send off this new committee. And then in the moment after that, without skipping a beat, one hand went up at that board meeting, and that hand was Judy Heumann. And she very gently said, I respectfully would like to take issue with what the rabbi just taught. She said, actually, the very outlook that Rabbi Steinlauf just tried to teach is the kind of outlook that all of us in the disabilities community are trying to overcome. She said, actually, we don't see ourselves as the most vulnerable and weakest members of society. We see ourselves as equal members of society, and that we are working toward a society that does not treat us like we are the weakest and the most helpless in society. And I just stood there. I can't even imagine what my expression was at that moment. At the end of the board meeting, I ran up to Judy and I begged her forgiveness. And with all the class and grace in the world, she said, listen, I'm gonna ask a favor. Do you mind if I invite some of my friends, some people I know who are also handicapped, to come meet with you and to talk to you about our experience? And I said, of course. So the meeting came, and little did I realize, and to my shock, it wasn't just a couple of people, it was like 15 or 20 people showed up for this meeting. A bunch of wheelchairs rolled in, as well as people who are blind, people who are deaf, people who are on the spectrum, people with cerebral palsy. All kinds of people showed up, and every one of them started telling me their story. And the people I met at that meeting were, some of them were like Judy, were leaders in disabilities rights activism in their lives. And others were leaders in a whole array of fields and professions. And there were also some young people there who were brilliant young people who were starting out on incredible life paths to become leaders in their own right as well. And I can tell you something, 2-1, not a single one of those people were in any way helpless or weak or needed our beneficent protection. That's not who these human beings were. And I'm sharing that story with you by way of showing how that's Torah in action. That is when the rubber hits the road about Torah. Torah is not supposed to be just a document that we study and intellectualize on. Torah is something that we have to embody. And Judy Heumann is the kind of person who takes the wisdom that we learn in Torah and embodies it and brings it to the world in extraordinary leadership. And so I'm so excited that she's going to be talking to us on Tuesday evening. In this week's Parsha, we are reading, as I mentioned before, about this bizarre disease, this pandemic of the biblical world called Tzara'at, which was this white scaly affliction on the skin that was, as we said, brought about because of evil speech. And there's a description of how the way it was recognized was only by people who were the most professionally trained to recognize this disease. And it was, in those days, it was the Kohen. And it says, V'ra'aha Kohen. When the Kohen sees it, then the Kohen can identify it. He was the one who was qualified to do that. And then that person had to go into quarantine after that. As I said before, it's just so uncanny how this makes such perfect sense now when we read it through the eyes that we have today. Even the descriptions about Tzara'at, this disease, we used to scratch our heads for years looking at these texts because they would say things like, you can get Tzara'at in your clothes, you can get Tzara'at in your house, right? And we would think, wow, what a strange supernatural disease. And in fact, of course, now it seems like, duh, we're all coming back when we have to go to the market and we're laundering our clothes and our masks. And we are thinking about houses that have this affliction because people have it in those homes and they have to stay separate from everybody else. It is remarkable. Anyway, I want to come back to this idea of the Kohen being the one to recognize this affliction. And it says, once that person has been in quarantine, it says, again, it keeps repeating the expression, V'ra'aha Kohen. The Kohen sees that person. And if the Kohen sees that that person is healed, that person is no longer tameh, they're no longer impure from the disease, and they are able, once again, eventually to return back to the camp. And very powerful stuff. And there's an interesting comment that I wanted to share with you. It's written by Rabbi Israel Yashua Trunk of Kutno, who's a 19th century Rebbe. And here's what he said about this idea of the Kohen being the one to see the affliction. It says, it seems that there is a hint here that when one checks a person, one must not only see what they lack in the place of the affliction, rather, one must see them in their entirety, including their elevated qualities. So what the Rebbe of Kutno was saying in this quote is, it's probably true that there were all kinds of medics amongst the Israelites. There were people whose job it was to treat boo-boos, people whose job it was to give these various herbal medicinal concoctions that people must have used in the ancient world. But when it comes to Tzara'at, only the Kohen, only the high priest and the other Kohanim were qualified to be able to see the nature of this affliction. Because, they are spiritual leaders, they are leaders in the community, and they have the ability to truly see the whole human being. They don't just look at the affliction, they see the whole human being. And in that, they have this extraordinary ability to see the nature of the healing. This is a commentary on the qualified leaders and people who are working in epidemiology and immunology, people like Danny Dweck and people like Tony Fauci and others who are doing extraordinary work, of course. but it's also a comment on us. It's also a comment on what we have a tendency to see and to not see in times of disease and when we're confronted by otherness. I don't know about you, but I have this uncanny experience sometimes. I like to go for runs, and I go for runs around the neighborhood here, and I go through these beautiful trails through the woods. And you usually don't see too many other people as you go through these trails, but I'm running along and sometimes somebody will be coming toward me. And there's that split second when they're doing the right thing where they quickly turn around and they kind of get away from me as I'm running by them. And at that moment, they are very rightly, they don't know if I have COVID or if I'm asymptomatic and contagious. So they're stepping away from me so that there's a safe distance between us. At the same time, there's a visceral level of, just for a split second, the visual of somebody turning away from you when you go near them, that tameh, I'm unclean, that sense that you are being shunned for a moment because you may have a disease or because you are diseased. That's a very human reaction, isn't it? To suddenly have this recoiling from people who have some sort of disease about them. And one of the tragedies of our human experience is that we often have that same recoiling reaction when we see people with disabilities, when we see people who are in wheelchairs, when we see people who speak or their voices are odd to us, or if they move in ways that aren't normal in our conventional experience. Very often people have that same kind of impulse to shun them, to treat them as unclean or to get away from them and to otherify them and to belittle them in so many ways. And all of us who are listening to my voice right now, we hear, we hear what I'm saying, and we understand that that's a shameful thing, that is a tragic thing that people do to people with disabilities when there is nothing diseased about them. But that is what happens. And we understand that that's wrong. And we hope to think of ourselves as the kind of people who would never do such a thing. But you know what? When I gave that Devar Torah to my board at Addis, I thought I was a pretty wise person back then. I thought I was so brilliantly teaching something about caring for those people who are so much weaker than we are. And I didn't have this teaching that I'm teaching today about the Kohen, the Ra'ah HaKohen, about the responsibility, particularly of spiritual leaders, but all leaders and all of us, to see the entirety of the human being and to look past our visceral reactivity and to see the human being, right? Really, I want to actually add something. I can tell you exactly why I was so dead wrong in that Devar Torah about the Ger, Yatom, and Almanah. It was wrong for me to say that we should be a society that protects them because they're weak. That's not what the Torah is trying to teach at all. The Torah is trying to teach actually the opposite, that the Ger, the Yatom, and the Almanah, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, and all of those people who often get pushed aside in society, it's trying to show us we have to create a society that never treats them like they are the weakest people, that never sees them as weak, but sees them as equally created, B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God, equal to all of us. Quite the opposite. My interpretation was almost to pity them in some way. And that's not at all what the Torah is trying to teach. It's trying to teach us the opposite of pitying them. It's trying to teach us what compassion is all about. In fact, I want to share a quote from Louise Penny, who talks about the difference between compassion and pity. She says, compassion involves empathy. You see the stricken person as an equal. Pity doesn't. If you pity someone, you feel superior. As long as there's pities in place, there's not room for compassion. It squeezes out the nobler emotion. So I recommend that we all cast aside these pitying notions, those of us who do not have a disability. Judy Heumann likes to teach, if we're all lucky, we're all going to be disabled at some point in our lives, because the alternative is not so good, right? We're all in this together. So Judy Heumann is going to speak to us 7:30 on Tuesday evening. She is an extraordinary teacher of what, the reason why she's speaking, and I had her speak, is because she's part of this program that I've brought to us this year called the Jewish Identity Institute, which explores the ways in which our Jewish identity informs our character and how it is there to shape us to become moral leaders in society. And I can't think of a better example than Judy Heumann. She is somebody who not only exemplifies courage, who not only exemplifies the braveness to be able to speak truth to power, but she is also truly a teacher of what real compassion means. It's the ability to create a society where we see all human beings as equally deserving of dignity, of love, of life, and of all kinds of dignity and support. And so I hope that you will join me in learning from Judy on Tuesday, and so she can teach you her Torah as she has taught me. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.